the show. I am so excited to bring to you Suzanne Simonetti. Suzanne, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me in the pond. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad you were here. I know we will have such a blast. And I would love for you to start with, how did you get into writing?
Well, Jen, it was over 10 years ago. I found myself reading a book and it was fiction. I loved a lot of fiction. And it I wasn't expecting this to happen, but I got to the end of the book and that little voice in my head went off that said, "You can do this." And I went, "Wow." And it just kind of took me to a whole new world. And that was the first moment where I actually even considered the concept that I could actually sit down and put pen to paper, so to speak.
So what did you start to write then?
Great question. So I'm one of those people who would just love to be a student for the rest of my life. So I investigated what kind of online workshops that there could be out there, and I found myself looking into Gotham Writers Workshop,
Okay.
and I took a couple of those. And I tell you something for anybody who's listening and that's interested in getting into writing, it's a great place to start because I gave me access to other writers, which I hadn't had before. And we would start with just kind of like short little stories and then critique each other's work. And this was a whole brand new world to me. It was like I had walked through an entire new door, and I learned a lot just from them, just from having my paragraphs critiqued and looked at, and it was really eye-opening for me. And then I started connecting with other writers through Facebook. This is over 10 years ago, and I have some friends who I've been friends, I've had connections with on Facebook for more than 10 years. One's Terry Thomas. She's a USA Today bestseller, and we had met through that social media, both aspiring writers, and here we are, both published authors. So it's great to network with other people who are in the same boat as you. And I'll say it again, if you can take any kind of online class, if you're, sheepish about things, you can do it from the privacy of your own home. Generally speaking, they don't cost a lot, but that's a definite great way to get started.
Oh, I love that. And you are hitting on a few things that I would love to expound upon. And one of which is the fact that, you're talking about like the community, you're talking about building that network, but part of that network started, really was about sharing your work and getting feedback and giving feedback. So what was that like when you were first getting started and it's your turn to share or it's your turn to contribute? I mean, what might you offer a new writer who is a little timid about offering feedback or receiving feedback?
Well, I tell you what, it's funny because I learned not just from the feedback I was given on my own work, but I also learned by critiquing others. And that's what's wonderful about it, because you're reading other people's work totally objectively. And you maybe can see a couple things where that don't make sense or where they might have gone wrong. So you're learning, like it's just like being in a room, and there's all these angles coming at you and you're learning. I think I even got, when I critiqued somebody's short story, I got feedback from the professor that was like, "Good point." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, so I know what I'm doing," and I was able to take criticism. One of the things that I learned very early on, you'll love this when you hear it, is that writing is generally a war on cliches, because my work was riddled with cliches. I hadn't realized it at the time. I just was writing and I was like, "Oh, I can't do that." So, and that's a very good, important lesson to learn right away. You don't want to have your fiction or anything you're writing littered with cliches. We want to clean those up. So.
So talk to me about that then. So when you're writing on your first pass, you might not even realize that you've written a cliche. So then how did you recognize that looking back at your piece going, "Oh, now I see it"? And then how did you go about reworking it?
Great question. When you first sit down, it's like when you first get your learner's permit, and you're just kind of like you're learning the basic steps. But until you start driving the car and having your own experience, you got to dig deep. You have to dig deep and say, "How can I say this better?" And that's where the creativity comes into place. That's where you're like, "What's in here?" A cliche is something that's been out there and that you borrow from somebody else. But what do I have to say? And then that's where you're like, "Okay, I need to do some digging here, and I need to put my voice on the page." And that's a great place. That's a great next step when you start to realize that you have to get in touch with what it is that's in your mind and what it is that you want to say and not borrow from other people. Yeah.
So when you're doing that and you're working on your piece and you've been getting feedback, you're giving feedback, you're refining your voice, you're refining how you're saying things, you're strengthening your writing. You also talked about earlier, you mentioned networking, the power of that community. So part of that starts because you've shared with somebody, you trust them, they trust you, and you start doing things together, you start connecting. And you mentioned doing that in social media, but how else has that networking helped you? Like sometimes when you're a writer, there's plenty of writers that listen to this show who are introverts, and it is painful to them to have to put themselves out there, to get visible, to talk about their work, or to, just be seen beyond, hey, I've published that book. So how would you encourage them to get out of their comfort zone and expand their network?
Well, I am an introvert completely, INFJ. And what's wonderful about a network or meeting people in places like online workshops or through social media who are like minded and are interested in writing is that you're going to face rejection, and there's always going to be that moment where you're going to have these days where you're like, oh wow, this is flowing, and then those days where you go back and read what you've written and it's just awful, and you need someone to talk to. And sometimes your spouse or your best friend, who, if she's not a writer or he's not a writer, they're not going to be able to relate, but the network will. And that's why it's so important that your writers friends in the network you can rely. I just had a Zoom with a young woman who is trying to get published, and she's searching for an agent, and she keeps sending me little emails like, oh my god, I got rejected again, I got rejected again. And I'm an open book. I'm like, I understand, I've been rejected by a bunch of agents myself. It is going to happen if you put yourself out there. So that network, it really is, it's vital because you're going to need that sense of support, especially if you want to keep going. And if you are going to keep going, you're going to find yourself tripping a lot, and that's okay. But in order to keep going, you need someone's hand to hold on to, and that's why it's just the network. I can't stress enough.
I love that. And so to your point about, rejections, which you're right, that happens when my co-author and I were querying our leadership book and we got the first rejection back, I was really disappointed. I was hurt. And then we got another one and I was really disappointed at that point. I'm like, what's going on? And I'm like, wait a minute. I shifted my view. I talked with my co-author, and it helped because not just that we were co-authors and friends, but again, we're in the same boat. We're seeing the same thing. And he reminded me that how important it was to go, hey, look, we want that door to close fast. I'm like, you're right. I know that. I want that door to close quickly, simply because it will move me to where I'm supposed to go, and not to view it as rejection as much as redirection. It's moving me where I'm supposed to go.
That's
So
right.
yeah. So what I did to kind of help cope for myself was that I came up with a song, and every time we saw one, I played it, and my poor co-author got to hear it each time, which was Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. So I would either
I
sing to
love that.
him that, or I would email it like a couple of the lines, and he was just like, is this going to happen each time? I said, pretty much, until I work it out of my system. Yeah. so
I
how
love that, Jim.
so how did you work through it? Like when you got rejections, like you mentioned, how did you work through that so that maybe it didn't sting the next time, or you just didn't let it bother you? Like, how did you work through that?
Change your head. Sometimes you just need to step away. Sometimes maybe some people will say write something else, but if you've got a piece of work that you really want to sell, that's really all you can think about. And sometimes writing, it can be hard, maybe journaling. But for me, it was change of head, maybe reading, maybe watching TV, going for a walk, and not thinking about it. There's got to be a balance in life. It can't be all about one thing. And maybe even exercise, anything that changes your head. And I had a mentor at the time, Caroline Levitt, who's a New York Times bestselling author. She was wonderful, and she's been writing for decades and is very successful. But she's also, of course, anybody who has reached that point in their life has faced, as you say, redirection or the rejection. So they know, and it's got to be expected. So there are always going to be people out there who are waiting with open arms to say, I understand. So you talk to somebody who knows, or change your head. Change your
I
head. Yeah.
yeah, and another way that helps me when I need to change that perspective or what have you, I'll watch a movie that's really funny. That one that I laugh
Yes.
every single time, that I always chuckle, or it always helps me change my perspective or just let go for a little bit. Like that helps too, because now you've kind of burned off some of that energy and you can redirect your energy. You can focus on something else, or you can focus on pitching again or what have you. So, I love
That's
that
right.
how you talked about that, like working with somebody, but doing something, exercising, something tangible even can help in that
That's
way.
right. Exactly. Yes. Exactly.
So you are uh, talking around different things that I would love for us to push
Yes.
into a little bit more, which is really about the business side of being an author.
Yes.
Once you have written, you have to do more than after once you hit publish. And part of that is querying, but part of that is networking, part of that is going to events or spaces where you are meeting new people, getting more visible. There's all different aspects of being in the author business. Would you talk some about that with me?
Yes. There's a lot, there's a lot of things that happen, and they're like from social media page, like I had to create an author business page and then a website and things like that. But it surely didn't happen all in the same week. You do these things in steps and you learn from others. But I love the business side. And I mentioned to you, I have a BS in marketing, and I was in corporate for many years, but that was a long time ago. So it's kind of fun to be able to use a little bit of that creativity on the business end of things to promote my work. And there is a lot to learn, but there's also a lot out there like there never was before. There's so many, yourself included, there's so many resources and podcasts available to writers that it wasn't like that even 15 years ago, where you really weren't sure of where to go first. Now it's everywhere. There's just so many resources available. And I would suggest tapping into that.
So what aspect of business in as the author side do you really enjoy the most? Like, is there one that you go, this really is fun? And I say that because I can't tell you how many book signings that I've been to where an aspiring author has come up to me and has said, hey, I'm writing this piece and so forth. And they tell me about it. I'm excited for them. And then and I'm like, hey, that's really great. And they go, yeah, but the writing side, I understand it, or that seems okay. But this side, and they'll gesture to the table, or they're inferring the business or being visible or what have you. It's kind of like, they're like, that side is really scary. That I don't understand, or that seems too hard. And I'm just like, but they're both fun. They're fun in their different ways. And in both of those cases, whether you are working on writing that book, getting that book ready for print, or you've published it and you're doing it, you can still work with different people to help you get there. You don't have to try to do it all yourself. When I first started, I was using a website that I did not have the skill set to totally
No,
code. I did not know how to do it, but I knew
no,
someone who did, and she was
that's right.
awesome. And
That's right.
that's okay too.
And it it is okay. And the other thing is, Jen, when you're thinking about all the hours and could be years that you've spent putting into this book that you've written, that's your baby, as we say. You want to get behind that, but more, it's about positioning, and you want to reach your reader. So you have to think about, well, who is my reader? And that's a very important component when you're selling a book. So it is fun because you want to get to the people who want your work, because there are people out there who will want your book, but you don't want to give it to people who aren't really going to be interested in what you have to say. And currently, I for this Christmas story that just came out, my book that I just launched, or it's really a novella, I self-published it. And I tell you what I'm having a blast with. I just did a book trailer and I'm running ads on Facebook, and I get to see how many clicks are coming in that are going to the Amazon. And then on the Amazon side of things, it's so much fun to see how my Amazon keyword ads are doing, because I'm actually, as we speak, I'm pushing paperbacks and I'm selling ebooks while we're talking. And it's so cool to see those numbers come in. And so it absolutely can be fun. It really can be, because this is all part of the business. It's all part of it, you know. And I want to, like I said, I want to reach my reader, people who want to be inspired by a heartwarming family Christmas tale, and they're out there, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So would you talk a little bit more about how you get to know who that reader is?
Sure. What I would do is it really comes down to comps probably, because if you're writing a story, then you want to say, well, who's writing books like mine? Like what author out there has a book similar to mine, and where do their readers live? Who are their readers? Start there. If you really don't know, look to other authors who are already doing it. I know that's what I've done. And they really help, especially the ones who are doing it well, and join those little reader Facebook groups. I'm in a million of them. And Instagram, follow the authors, see who their readers are, see what they're interested in, and see how your book, whatever you've written or whatever you want to write, sort of measures up. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I love that. I love that. And what I also hear you doing is getting curious. You know, you're getting curious about that person that you want to connect with through your book. And you're getting curious about how the ads are doing, or how Amazon is what the responses are to the things that you've put in. So what I see that's happening is that just as a writer, you are curious about where your character is going to take you, like where you think you were going to go. And then your character says, no, no, we're not going that way. We're going this way. You know, so you're curious and you follow that path. You, I hear you using that same process in the business side, between figuring out a marketing strategy, figuring out an ad strategy, if that's what you're going to do, getting to know your reader and connecting with your reader. So would you talk a little bit more about this novella and how it came to be? Because, you know, so a novella is going to be a shorter piece, but how did
Yeah.
this come about?
Well, it's wonderful because I was called by a neighbor, Kathy Brown. She said she wanted to meet for my first novel, The Sound of Wings, my debut that came out in 21. So just a year ago in October, they called me to Lucky Bones restaurant and we had a book club and about the story. And I just left that meeting feeling completely charged up. And I said to myself, my readers need more. And I knew I was going to set the story in Cape May, and I wanted it to be something that was sort of a love letter to Cape May, and feasibly something I could do within a year. And I was able to get this out. It's 30,000 words. I think a standard novel is about 80. My first book was 80,000. So that's what inspired me. And I just hit the ground running, and I took it away, and I knew that I was going to launch it in October, and it was going to be set around Christmas time, which is spectacular in Cape May. There was so much to write about, and I put it around this one little family. Yeah. And it was
So
just it was a wonderful project.
it sounds like it. And so where we were talking earlier in the show about like the networking and the getting curious and the feedback and leveraging the business parts of it all, how did those elements show up in helping to bring this book to life?
Well, one of the things I'll stress is having editors. You need good editors. And I'm not talking about just a proofreader, but I'm talking, you need a developmental editor. I would never publish a book without one. I think I took it to March and I got so tired of looking at it. It was done, but it wasn't done, if you know what I mean. I said, I have to get that. And she said to me, send it to me. Let me look at it. And like my first developmental editor on the first story, she killed off a character that happened in both of my, which is really eye-opening. And at first, when I saw that, and I said, okay, now I have to prove my point of why I can't get rid of this character. And I sat with it for 5 days. I didn't do anything. And then I said, no, actually, she's right. And I'm going to get rid of the character. And I did. And it's a better story. So that's very important, as is the line proofing and copy editing. And then, of course, you need the proofreading. So don't skimp on the editing. You need that. I know I will say this anywhere. I will never, ever, ever write a story myself and publish it without having several sets of eyes on it. Yeah.
Okay, I have to tell you that I love the fact that your editor came back and said, we have to kill off these characters, this particular character. And you're like, how do I defend their honor? Your first reaction was, I need to defend my character. And your character's at first
Yep.
sitting beside you going, yeah, that's right. Defend me, until you come to
Yep.
the same space and go, sorry, buddy. And he's like, Et tu brute
Yep.
type of thing.
Yes, and it was interesting because the character she killed off, I wanted to show what it was like from a visitor's perspective coming to Cape May and experiencing the town. But what I was able to do was pull out the daughter-in-law who had never been to Cape May and show it through her eyes. I'm like, okay, the visitor can go, and I'm just going to focus on the family. And ultimately, she was absolutely right. She said, "You're getting, it's too much. Focus on this family." And it was absolutely the right way to go. So I don't have a knee-jerk reaction. Try not to get defensive. I'm not defensive when people are critical of my writing. I welcome it. Even if you might be a little stung and you have to think about it for a few days, it's important to take that time to really think about it before you have that knee-jerk reaction, because obviously this person is only trying to help you.
But I love that you did take it on board and figure out a way. But to your point, you took a breather. You got the feedback, decided I might need to defend their honor, and then come around to that perspective. But what did you do to kind of actually go from I need this character to stay versus I'm okay rewriting to write them out? What did you do? Did you, like, first off, for instance, try a chapter where they were present and rewrite it from a different angle? Did you kind of make out a little straw man of pros and cons of why this character? So like what helped you to work through that? Because when you hear this character needs to go, I mean, you're right that the editor that you've chosen, provided they're giving their feedback kind and constructive, they are trying to help you make it better. But that doesn't mean that you have to take everything on board that they say too, because you might
that,
have proven your point
that
that this character really does need to stay. It just needs
that's absolutely
grown.
true. That is absolutely true. I think it's a great question. The first thing I had to do was when I first went, oh, no, I have to prove my point that this character needs to stay, was, well, what is this character bringing to the table? Why do I have her in there? Why is it vital to the story? Why is her perspective so needed? And in thinking through that, her importance in the story, I was able to say, but this can be captured in other ways. I can capture this perspective. It wasn't the character per se. I mean, I loved her storyline with her husband, and that will be captured in another story. But the general sentiment here was I wanted to show Christmas in Cape May, and I was able to do that through another character's eyes. So I think if you're just reasonable and you logically think it out, which is what I did, that's how I was able to say, okay, bye bye, Ginger.
But to your point, no, bye bye, Ginger. But to your point, I love that. You also can say, this set of characters, I really do like them and I see possibility. So put them over in put them in a new Word doc where there's story number 2 possibility. So it could be that they show up in a different story that's supporting this same setting. It's just in a different time, or it's a different, it might even be the same place, it might be a different place, but these characters could show up elsewhere. You don't have to
Absolutely.
throw it all away.
Absolutely, Jen. And not every great idea needs to make it into this one story. I have a folder on my computer called extra footage. So all the hundreds of thousands of words that have not been published are saved in that, including Ginger and her husband. They're all saved in extra footage so that I can go back to it and revisit and see, okay, where was I headed with that? And can I glean any ideas or inspiration from what was already, an idea I already had that necessarily didn't need to make it into these 2 stories.
So
Yeah.
with this extra footage, I love that name. Would that also help with like blurbs or marketing pieces for the book, because they were parts of this book at one point? Do they help you with that kind of aspect in the business in the book?
The extra footage, probably not, because it's really just stuff that was sitting in the drawer at the time. So no, I don't think so. But it's always good to go back to the heart of the story, why you wrote it in the first place, and what you want the reader to feel.
Yes.
As far as blurbs and what the essence of the story is. What is it about? Why should I pick it up? Why bother reading it?
Very true. Very true. But then that still goes back to the getting the feedback, the networking, and the whole business side of those, because the blurb is a marketing piece. It's a different type
That's
of
right.
writing than the actual book that you wrote. And it's so funny because I've seen this meme recently where it's like writing, 80,000 words. Yeah. Writing this itty bitty blurb. Oh, kind of a feeling of how do you shift that? Because it is such a big piece. And even when you think about it from, being in school and you had to write a paper and then write the abstract to the paper, it's similar, but it's still different. It's different type of writing. So do you
It
have
isn't.
any
Yeah.
do you have some tips on how to write a stellar blurb?
I think I took, I'm trying to remember if it was Brian Cohen. There's a few out there that you can look, there's actual tutorials on this, and they give you ideas on sort of how to write a blurb and what not to do. And, for instance, the back of my book, it says, but things aren't as cheery as they seem in the Abernathy's magnificently decorated Victorian home. So I did that in the middle of the blurb because I wanted to create some intrigue. And I learned that through one of the tutorials it is really definitely a marketing aspect. And I would say get help with that. And surely your developmental editor, any editor, could help you with that because they've read the story and they're good at things like that. So you could absolutely ask a professional that you're working with. Yeah.
Yeah, and if that editor in particular says, "Hey, you really want somebody with this kind of background to help or specializes in this," that's okay too, because the more eyes you get, the more that network. I mean, I love how it keeps coming back to network and the business side, because sometimes when you think about writing a book and you're focused on the craft and you're focused on getting that draft to the next stage of whether or not you're querying or you go ahead and start to publish. But once you've hit publish, you're really putting on a new hat, and all of those things that you were doing to get to that point, you're continuing to use them to grow. So,
That's
I mean,
right.
I love how you've done this, it's just little building blocks. It feels like this whole conversation.
Yes.
I love that. I
Yes.
love that. So talk
Yes.
to me about one of the things that you did, you said with this particular book was you used Facebook ads and you're driving them back to Amazon. So you can see kind of like a twofold approach. Do you have any tips for an author who might be thinking about Facebook ads or any kind of ad like that, so that they know how to ease into it? Because the idea of doing ads might sound really cool, and how do I do this?
If you're really scared or if you really don't know, I would say, and I'm being totally honest here, YouTube, Facebook ads, that's what I did, and start there. But then there are, like I said, Brian Cohen, there are so many um, resources out there available. And one of the things I was able to learn was that I dropped my Amazon link on my Facebook ads so that when people click the shop now button, it drops them right onto Amazon. I'm also able to tell them the Amazon Author Central side how many people are clicking from that ad. It's called Amazon attribution. I just learned it this week.
Oh, cool.
And so you never stop learning. You'll never stop learning. So it can be overwhelming, but it really doesn't need to be. Just think about your objectives and what your next step needs to be. And there's unlimited resources, including YouTube. There's so many different tutorials. They'll take you step by step on so many aspects of the business. It's really true. Yeah.
Oh, I love that so much. That's a really great point. And I mean, just like on your website, if you built, one intake form for your newsletter itself and maybe a different intake form for, a specific thing you're doing or for a specific event that you've done, and you want to see the traction between one event versus a general form, it's the same concept as what I'm hearing you're
That's
talking
right.
about on that back end with the attributions. But it all goes back to that learning and the just
Yes.
the growth of that and being really curious and figuring things out and looking at it with fresh eyes, like you were talking about earlier with how you handled the edits. I mean, you came back with
That's
fresh
right.
eyes, and those fresh eyes made a difference.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we can bang our heads against the wall. It's like if you're having that day where the words aren't coming, sometimes it's best to just close the laptop and go for the walk and change your head and change directions. There are so many different options, and there's so many other things you could be doing. I know when I get stuck in my writing too, another thing I do is if there's a scene I know needs to be written, but it has nothing to do with what I'm working on, I'll start working on that scene. It could be at the end of
Mhm.
the book. And I'll say, okay, you know what? Let's go to the end. Let's start writing a scene there. And all these ideas come, and then you'll realize in the scene maybe something else has to happen earlier in the book, and then you're like, oh wait, let me go back. And so now all of a sudden you're moving back and forth through the plot, which is what you want. You want to be you're dancing with the book. You're not sitting down writing a story. You're dancing with the story the whole time.
Oh, I love how you put that. That is so cool.
Thank
Suzanne,
you. Yeah.
this is awesome. Seriously, thank you so much.
Yay.
Where can people connect with you?
Thank
Where can they get
you.
your books?
Well, my website is my first and last name. It's Suzanne Simonetti, SuzanneSimonetti.com. You can buy both my books on my website, also available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, all those good places. And first and last name, same deal for all the social media. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, still on Twitter, and LinkedIn. You do a lot on there on LinkedIn and Twitter, but I am on there. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This has been a blast. Thank you so, so much. I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you, Jen. So great. Thanks so much, Jen.